Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 91 of Only Human. Today, we're going to continue our discussion about leadership. And I'm going to use an example of three leaders I've served for. Completely different styles, completely different personalities, and all of them had a lasting stamp on who I am today. And I'd invite you to reflect on people that you've worked with or worked for, and then also to reflect on the kind of leader you might be to others. And I sort of decided on this because I got one of those unfortunate emails this week that said a former colleague and commander of mine had passed away. And so we'll start with this gentleman. His name was Brigadier General Carl Riddell. And General Riddell was my boss when I first became a history professor at the United States Air Force Academy. But the story goes back a little bit before that. I was at Intermediate Service School, Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army, back in 1995. And I had a follow-on assignment back into the B-1. And about 2 weeks before I graduated, we were already planning to pack and head to Mountain Home, Idaho. And that the stand-up of the unit that I was going to be working in had been delayed by a year, and that I had to go find somewhere to work. Wasn't quite as easy back in those days, early days of computerization of assignments. But I scrambled around and I found an opening at West Point for a history professor. And I had a doctorate and I had a master's degree in military history. And so I said, West Point for a year or two, that wouldn't be too bad. So I picked up the phone and I called him, and the guy that answered said, "Man, if you'd have called me 45 minutes ago, we'd have hired you in a minute. But we had our officer out at the Air Force Academy for a 2-year stint, and we had to call him back to fill his slot. So we know they have a slot at the Air Force Academy. Maybe you can pick up the phone and call their personnel officer." I said, Do you have his number?" He goes, "Yeah, let me get it for you." So he comes back in about, 30 seconds or so, and he said, "This guy's name is Jim Dillard, and I think he's a former B-1 guy, and he's now at the Air Force Academy, and he's listed as their personnel officer." I said, "Jim Dillard?" And it turned out I used to fly with him and crew with him in the squadron a few years before, so that was a good signal, right? So I called him up and said, "Yeah, we got an opening, and I'll do everything I can to get your application in. But let me tell you something: we've got a boss who wants to personally interview any new member of the faculty, and he's a little bit of a weird guy, but we got to fill this pretty quick. I'll see what I can do." So we hang up. I've got a little bit of excitement, enthusiasm. He says he wants to meet you at the Kansas City airport this Saturday at 4:00. That's about the weirdest thing I've ever heard. He said he's passing through. It's as close to you as he's going to get, and so see if you can make it. So scrambled around, and we ended up meeting at a bar in the airport in Kansas City. And I can remember that there was a college football game going on that I was super interested in, and it was on all the TVs in this airport bar. And I sat down to talk to him, and I glanced up at the TV, and he said, "Is there something else that you really need to be doing right now?" And I go, No, sir." So for the next 90 minutes, I got to know this gentleman. His name was Carl Riddell. At that time, he was in charge of the history department at the Air Force Academy. I knew nothing else about him. Don't know whether the interview went well or didn't go well when I left. I remember calling Sherry, my wife, and said, I don't know how this is going to go, but we'll see. About 7:30 that night, I get a phone call, and he said, "I've pondered this a little bit. I think we'd like to give you a shot. Would you like to come to the Air Force Academy?" So that's how that all happened. It was sort of a weird sequence of events, kind of probably divinely inspired looking back. But So I come in there, and shortly after I got there, he asked me if I would be willing to teach a variety of military history courses, and of course I said yes. So I get my little office there on the top floor of Fairchild Hall at the Air Force Academy, and I'm getting ready, preparing my courseware and all this stuff. And he'd asked me to send an end of week note on where I was at and if I needed any help. The computers were all down, so I scribbled out a little note on a piece of stationery, and I went in and I folded it in half. His office was locked, so I slid it under the door. So the next morning, about 10 o'clock, his secretary comes down and says, Colonel Riddell would like to speak with you for a moment. So I said, okay, great. So I walked down there, knock on the door, Major Kern reporting, sir. He says, Tony, come on in, come on in. He picks up this note that I had sent him. He says, have a seat. He says, I want to compliment you on your penmanship. So the first official real conversation I have with my new boss, and he comes out with this, right? He goes, in today's world, people don't take the time to develop, a fine hand. And he goes, this is really good work. He said, I noticed all the T's were crossed horizontally, your I's were dotted, your commas were in the right place. And it was really a pleasure to read this. So I just wanted to take a minute and tell you how much I appreciated that. I mean, nothing about the content of the memo. It was all about my handwriting. And he paused for a couple of seconds. He goes, let's get a cup of coffee. So I'm thinking, this is getting weirder and weirder. So we go down and we get a cup of coffee. We come back and we sit down, and he says, you know why I mentioned this to you? And I go, no, sir, but I am absolutely curious to hear what you have to say. He said, someone that takes the time to learn to write well probably took the time to learn a lot of things, right? To do a lot of things well. What else can you do? Right? Sir, I'm a knuckle dragon B1 pilot, a lifelong learner. I've done some academic training and all that stuff. He goes, no. He goes, what else can you do? And I said, well, I think I'm a pretty good father, and I hunt and fish, and love the outdoors, and I like to go for long drives. He goes, what is it about long drives you like? And I'm thinking, He said, well, you get to see places you've never seen before. And he said, yeah. He goes, yeah. He goes, I need to tell you a little bit about my background. And that's when I learned that this little administrative academic guy that I was sitting in front of had a pretty fantastic career. He came out of, I think, Drake University, where he was a prolifically successful distance runner, track and field scholarship. Ended up in ROTC, where he was a distinguished graduate, and upon graduation, got assigned to Vietnam. And he served over there for 3 tours of duty, I think. Short tours, 6 months, 6 months, 6 months, something like that. And then eventually went on to become a Russian scholar. This was at the height of the Cold War. And in fact would become the first Air Force active duty officer to do an exchange with the Soviet Union. And he actually taught at Moscow State University. Okay? When I was graduating from high school, he was over teaching at Moscow State University. Eventually was assigned to a variety of assignments as the United States' leading scholar on the Soviet Union. Not only their current cultural aspect, but all their military history. Taught at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And anyways, he ended up as the director of the Department of History, permanent professor at the Air Force Academy. But he got called away when we signed the START treaties, and he led the teams to Russia that actually verified that Russia was disassembling their missiles and all that. I mean, when you look at this guy, you would never, ever think that he had this vast background, right? And so he tells me a little bit about himself and tells me what my job and my duties are going to be. And over the next 3 years while I served under General Riddell, he would continue to teach and lead and mentor in that manner, where he'd find some small thing that you would say or you would do, and he would take that into a larger lesson. You know, who would have thought that penmanship would lead to a discussion of somebody that learned to write well would probably learn well, and somebody that enjoyed the outdoors and seeing new things would explore different aspects of history than the textbook had to offer. And so, you know, it really deeply saddened me to hear of his passing this last week, but it led me to reflect on other leaders that I've had. And gosh, when you serve in a military career, you're changing commanders all the time. And then I went into the federal government where there are many leaders as well. And I looked back on the two or three of them that really made an impact on me. And then I reflected on what kind of impact I'm having on others, and how some of the DNA from Carl Riddell and these other two, who I'll talk about here in just a second, found their way into me, and maybe through me into others. So enough on General Riddell. They're going to bury him at the Air Force Academy this week, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to make the trip up there. But shortly after I left the Air Force, I went to work for the federal government as the Director of Aviation for the U.S. Forest Service, right? Largest non-military government program in the world, aviation program in the world. And I worked for a gentleman named Jerry Williams. And Jerry is the next leader I want to talk about. First of all, I was an outsider. I came from the Air Force, and within the federal government, they almost always promote from the inside. So I had no real idea why Jerry would have selected me. But we did a little interview, and we talked a little bit about hunting and fishing, and you know, I can't remember what, and that was it. And next thing I know, I'm getting a phone call saying, can you come to work in Washington, D.C.? So once again, we pack up the family and move like we had gotten so used to. And we moved out to Northern Virginia, and I remember riding the VRE, Virginia Railway Express, into Washington, D.C., and walking up there about 7 in the morning into my new office, where I shared a wall with the Holocaust Museum right there across from the Washington Monument. And Jerry was already in there, and he sees me come in, and he goes, Tony, come on in. I got to tell you a few things. He says, first things first, he goes, let's get a cup of coffee. And so we go toward where the general population coffee bar is. He goes, no, we're not drinking that crap. He goes, this is way too hard a job to drink bad coffee. So we go into his office, and he's got one of those great big cool coffee makers and some kind of organic dark roast from Kenya or something, and brews this really wonderful cup of coffee. He serves it to me in a nice ceramic cup with a Forest Service logo on it. And we sit down, and he said, do you know why I hired you? And I said, no, sir. I absolutely have no idea, but I'd be interested in hearing. He said, because you're a good writer. I go, what? He goes, yeah, everything else equal. And there were a lot of qualified candidates, but I'll always pick the person that can write the best. And he goes, I've read parts of your books and some of the other things you've written, and you're really, really good writer. I go, well, thank you, sir, but what's that got to do with running a great big old aviation program? And he says, someone who's a good writer is also going to be a good communicator, and somebody who's a good communicator is going to be a good leader in this organization. And so I thought, another weird little twist of how you impact people in ways you would never ever think that you were impacting them. So that was fascinating. And he goes, I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to share a few pearls of wisdom here on how to survive this job. And I said, I don't mind at all. Do you mind if I take a few notes? No, absolutely, go ahead. So he said, the first one is the coffee. He goes, but the second one is your schedule. And I thought, here it comes, man. You're going to be working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. I'd heard that working in Washington, D.C. could be hell. And he said, I don't want you to ever fill your schedule up more than halfway on any given day. He says, better maybe a couple hours of a firm schedule for the next day. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I said, okay, I understand clearly what you're saying there, but I don't really get why. I know there's an awful lot of work to do. I mean, I've got to talk to all the regional aviation officers and the standardization people, and I got a lot of things to do. I'd like to get those on my schedule. He goes, no, there's no more than half on your schedule. He said, in this job, the rest of the work will come to you during the day. And boy, was that ever a pearl of wisdom. And I've tried to follow that for the rest of my life in every job, including the one I currently have. Because if you don't leave space for the stuff that's going to come flowing downhill at you, you have no space, or you spend every day, at the end of the day, calling back people and saying, I'm sorry, I have to cancel our meeting for tomorrow, or working well past, 5 or 6 o'clock at night. And that little bit of guidance that the work will come to you, right? Make sure you have room for it. Make sure you have energy for it. Was absolutely vital in me surviving my time in Washington, D.C. And he said, here's the second thing. He said, I want you to have a special project, something that you want to accomplish while you're here. He said, these are typically 4 or 5 year assignments. And he said, if you don't have that, and when you have a few extra minutes of time, when your schedule doesn't get full because the work didn't come to you, I want you to working on that project and that project only. He said, because otherwise, 4 years from now, you're going to look back and say, I accomplished nothing. And that was really powerful for me. And so I've kept that in mind, for the last 20 years. Always have a special project that's meaningful to you, meaningful to others, that you can work on when you get a few minutes of downtime. And so I did that. I worked on a whole strategic plan on how to replace an aging fleet of aircraft. It didn't come into being when I was there, but that plan was the forerunner of many of the very large air tankers and jet-powered air tankers and things like that we have out in the field today. So Jerry's guidance on not overtasking yourself, realizing how much work could come to you in any given day, his insight that being a good communicator, which began with being a good writer, would be invaluable, and his idea that pick one thing that you want to finish and then work on it until it's finished, it's just something that stayed with me. And, I've written a couple books before that, but I've written 10 books since, all because I put that on my list of, I really want to finish this big thing. I'm not going to block out a bunch of time to do it, but when I have time, rather than go waste it, I'm going to put that time into a worthy cause, one that I selected, one that I'm passionate about, and one that I'm going to complete. So an easygoing guy. I mean, he was a former wildland firefighter, and he says, hey, I joined this organization because I wanted to know where the elk herds were, and I knew that if I was driving around a lot in a green Forest Service pickup, I could find them. And here I am, head of the whole organization now. It's really been a miracle. It really wasn't a miracle. Here was a guy that knew how to communicate, knew how to shape new leaders, and he never really got down in my decision space unless I went to him and I said, I can't make this decision on my own. So another really cool guy, and he's, to the best of my knowledge, still with us. The last leader I want to talk about today is completely different than these two. He was my first B-1 squadron commander. His name was Carl Peters. And I was in the 28th Bob Squadron in Kansas, McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, Kansas. And I remember when I first came in, I looked at all the names on the board, and it was weird because there was a whole bunch of people that had 2 first names, right? Carl Peters, Bob Tom, Don Ralph, Bill Howell. I mean, there were just a whole bunch of them. It was a great squadron because they were all volunteers. We were all selectively picked. We were having a blast flying brand new airplanes, and and he really, stayed out of my development. Every once in a while, he'd ask me how it was going, but pretty much left me alone until I think this was in my first year there in the squadron. I was flying a low-level route out in western Kansas, and after you come up out of the low-level route, there's a check to run. You sweep the wings forward, and you slow down, and one of the items on that checklist is to make sure the center of gravity, which has some automatic pumps. When you move the wings forward, the pumps will pump fuel from the forward body toward the aft body until you get the right center of gravity. And it's always supposed to happen within about a minute. You got your target center of gravity little indicator, and the actual center of gravity will stop right when it gets there. Except this time it didn't stop. It went right past that target and kept moving forward. And abnormal, right? Fuel was transferring. You have one basic button you can push. It's a fuel center gravity management system. We called it Mr. Figgums. And you push that button, it was supposed to reset everything. Didn't do anything. So for those of you that don't know, center of gravity on an aircraft is important because if it gets too far aft, you can't control the airplane. It just flies up and stalls. We've seen a couple accidents like that, like when cargo shifts on a big airplane, it breaks loose of its ties and goes to the back and they stall. If it goes too far forward, which was what was happening to us that evening, you can't have enough flight control. You can pull stick as far back as you want, and it's still going to descend. And so I was trimming off the pressure as it got more and more forward and did some quick time and distance calculations. We were in western Kansas, but it became readily apparent we weren't going to be able to get back to Wichita. So we declared an emergency, and we ended up landing at Liberal, Kansas in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. And I remember holding that stick back and feeling the lactic acid in my bicep as I was trying to flare that airplane to get it to land. That's how heavy the airplane was. So back to Carl Peters, right? So we land the airplane, make sure the chocks are in or everything, and get a local hotel and a cab and call it into the command post, and they're going to send a truck with some maintainers out the next day. And the other thing to remember, at this time, the B-1 was a highly political aircraft. Ronald Reagan said build 100 of them in 4 years because they're going to cancel it the minute I'm out of office, right? And so they did. They built all those aircraft very, very quickly. And you almost felt like a test pilot because something weird like this was happening every couple of flights back in those days. Airplanes turned out to be a tremendously capable airplane as it matured. But the mechanics come out. I get back up in the morning. I go out there, start the engines up. Nothing's wrong, right? Could not duplicate. They were starting to look at me like, did you just turn the aft pump on and forget it? Just tell us the truth. We don't want to have to tear apart an airplane when you can tell us you just screwed it up. So Major, tell us what really happened here. And it's like, yeah, no, this is exactly what we did. We came up, we brought the wings forward, it migrated forward. We couldn't stop it. We pushed the button just like the checklist says, didn't help. We declared emergency and we landed. I said, okay, well, it's all good now. And even if it starts to do the same thing, you've got enough time to get it from here to McConnell. So you guys could fly it back. I said, sure. So we fly back and we land. We shut it down, start it up, shut it down, start it up. Could not duplicate. Maintenance couldn't find the problem. But because we declared an emergency, it got out that the B-1's having a problem they can't identify. And all hell breaks loose from Strategic Air Command headquarters all the way down. Now, I don't know this is happening because I'm finished flying. I'm home in crew rest. I come in the next day. And there's a note that says, Colonel Peters would like to see you. So to describe this guy, he's a little guy. He's about 5'6", got kind of an Irish leprechaun look about him, funny as heck, just a guy you really like to work for. But I didn't know him very well. And as I'm walking toward his office, I can hear he's on the phone, so I wait outside the door. And he says, yes, they did that. They did it twice. Yeah, they analyzed the generator. They looked at central integrated test system. There were no codes. No, I'm telling you, the fuel was migrating forward, and I spoke to them for an hour last night. I know exactly what happened. This was not a crew error problem. No, this was an airplane problem, and we're leaving that airplane on the ground until we can figure out what it is. Yes, General. Very well, General. Yep, no, I'm telling you, I trust this guy. He's one of my very best, et cetera. And then I hear him hang up the phone. I walk in the door. He goes, "You did all that shit, right?" I go, "What?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You did all those things you just heard me talking about through the door." I said, "Yeah, I mean, we eventually did them all." I said, I followed the checklist, pushed the button. I had my hands full of airplanes, so I brought it down and landed it." He goes, "Yep, that's kind of what I thought." He said, "Here's the deal, Tony." He says, "This airplane, as you know, is a political hot potato right now. They're trying to pin it on you. It would be so much easier to say, it was a pilot error and you guys screwed something up and put that airplane back in the sky." He says, "But I'm not going to do that." He said, "But I really need you to look me in the eye and tell me you didn't screw anything up last night." And I said, I don't think so." I said, my co-pilot, Jack Keitel, was right there beside me. We looked at everything. We did all we could, but like I said, it was dark. Airplane was getting heavy in the nose. We did what we thought we had to. We found the closest available landing strip. We put it on the ground. So, all right. Well, Carl's lesson to me from that whole experience was that when you have people that are trusted, subordinates, you have to trust them, right? And he was put on the spot by his commanders, asking them to find a scapegoat, and he wouldn't do it. Right? He just wouldn't do it. And I have a feeling that if I had screwed it up, he would say, "Just keep it to yourself," but I hadn't. And that sort of support from a leader when something goes wrong, and potentially it's going to be the easiest thing in the world to blame the operator or to blame the person closest to the problem, he would have none of that. And you can imagine the kind of loyalty that built into this guy. So I felt like I was a little bit closer to him then. A couple weeks later, something happens. I have a little problem in the airplane. I don't quite understand it, and I'm reading the books. I can't get it out of the books, and I come in and I asked him. I said, "Colonel Peters, you seem to be, you're an instructor pilot, and you seem to be pretty spooled up on this stuff." I said, "Can I ask you a question about this particular system?" He goes, "You need to ask a real IP." He goes, I don't know this airplane very well either." He says, "Nobody really knows this airplane very well, but let's get a group of people together and we'll talk about it." And he says, "Go find Todd Boudinot or Curtis Petrick. Those guys are the nerds that know these systems. And when you figure it out, come back and tell me." So, open, honest, and had your back, right? A guy that you could relate to, but yet had a steep enough authority gradient to where you were going to do what he told you when he told you. And that began to shape my leadership in a different way. So looking back across all three of these guys, what are the things that I learned? And probably from Jerry Williams and Carl Riddell, I learned to look deep at people before you move them into a position, right? That hour and a half that I spent in the Kansas City airport across from General Riddell, answering his questions about a variety of things, and that first meeting I had where he praised my penmanship and then turned it into a valuable leadership lesson, told me that there were subtle ways to get to know someone, what their core values and being was all about. Right? With Jerry, I was walking into a job where I was over my head. I was going to be in over my head from the very minute I arrived there. So what's the first thing he does is, "This job's way too hard to not drink good coffee." The second thing he does is talk about communication, right? Good writers be good leaders because they're good communicators. He talks about not overburdening your schedule, and he talks about having one priority that you're going to work on. Right? all in a 25-minute cup of coffee on my first day of work. Those lessons I carry with me to this day. And then from Carl, I learned that even when it's easiest to push the blame down to somebody else, you don't. You stand up for your people, and even when it's politically incorrect to do so, you realize that bond between you as a leader and them as one of the trusted experts out there is a strong one. You selected them for the right reasons, and so you back them when you have to, when you can, when you get every opportunity to. So it's fascinating to look back at those three, and as I was trying to find a fourth one or a fifth one, or you know what I found? I found that I could barely recall the names or the faces of many of the commanders and leaders that I've worked for. People that I'll call managers rather than leaders. They left no real impact, at least not on me. And so I decided then and there that if I was ever going to be a powerful leader, a good leader, it would be for those types of characteristics, right? Trusting your people, giving them the little pearls of wisdom they need to succeed, letting them know why you found them special. Those are the items that I grasped from three of the most influential leaders that I've ever worked for. I hope this has been of some value for you today, and I'd ask you again to reflect on the people that have made a difference in your life, how they made that difference, and if it was kind of weird and iconic, sort of like my three guys. I mean, they didn't come out and say, here's what I value and what you need to do. They came at it from different directions and in different ways, and for whatever reason, it stuck with me. So thanks for joining us here on Only Human. I hope you'll join us again next Tuesday, and every Tuesday we drop at 9 o'clock. And like always, get better where you are with the resources at hand, and we'll see you soon.